Sometimes grief makes us do the unthinkable. Sometimes losing everything gives us the courage to risk what little remains. Lady Maren stood before the iron gates of Ravenscroft Castle, her worn hands gripping a simple cooking pot. At 52, she had buried her husband and watched fever take her youngest child. Her inn was gone. Her savings were spent. The villagers called her mad for accepting the vampire lord's summons. They whispered he would drain her blood within days. But Maren knew something they didn't. She had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Lord Caleb had sent word throughout the kingdom, seeking a cook brave enough to serve in his cursed castle. While others fled in terror, Maren saw opportunity. What did an immortal monster want with simple country cooking? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The iron key turned with a grinding protest that echoed through the morning mist. Maren pushed open the gates of Ravenscroft Castle, her copper cooking pot clutched against her chest like a shield. The sound of her footsteps on the cobblestone path seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that surrounded this place. She had walked for 3 days to reach this forsaken corner of the kingdom, sleeping in hedgerows and eating stale bread. Her feet ached in her worn boots, but she pressed forward with the determination of a woman who had already survived the worst life could offer. The castle loomed before her, its black stone walls rising like accusations against the grey sky. Gargoyles perched on every corner, their stone eyes following her progress up the winding path. Ivy crawled across the walls like grasping fingers, and several windows were boarded shut, while others gaped like empty eye sockets. This was not the grand fortress she had imagined when the messenger had delivered Lord Caleb's summons to her failing inn 6 weeks ago. The memory still burned fresh in her mind. She had been scrubbing tables in the empty common room, trying to decide whether to sell her last pewter mug or her grandmother's silver thimble to buy flour, when the black-cloaked figure had appeared in her doorway. His face had been hidden beneath a deep hood, but his voice had been cultured, precise. "Lady Maren of Millbrook Inn," he had said, though she had long ago stopped calling herself Lady anything. "My master seeks a cook of particular skill and courage, one who has known loss and hardship, one who will not flee at the first sign of strangeness." She had laughed, actually laughed, at the audacity. "Sir, I have buried 3 husbands, raised 5 children, and watched this inn die by degrees. What manner of strangeness could possibly frighten me now?" The messenger had placed a leather pouch on her scarred wooden table. The weight of it had made her breath catch. More coin than she had seen in 2 years. "My master is Lord Caleb of Ravenscroft. He requires a cook who can prepare meals that remind him of mortality. The position offers shelter, sustenance, and this payment for each month of service. The only requirement is that you must not fear the darkness." Now, standing before the massive oak doors of the castle's main entrance, Maren wondered if she had been hasty in her acceptance. But behind her lay only the memory of her youngest son's fever-bright eyes and the bill collectors who had stripped her inn bare. Before her lay mystery, yes, but also possibility. She lifted the brass knocker, shaped like a wolf's head with ruby glass eyes, and let it fall 3 times. The sound reverberated through the heavy wood like thunder. Minutes passed before the door swung open with surprising silence. A woman stood in the doorway, perhaps 60 years of age, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and wearing a black dress that seemed to absorb light. Her face was pleasant enough, though her eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much. "You must be Maren," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Maren couldn't place. "I am Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper. Lord Caleb is expecting you." Maren stepped across the threshold and immediately felt the temperature drop. The entry hall stretched before her like a cathedral nave, with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow. Tapestries hung from the walls, their colors muted by age and neglect. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that made the portrayed figures seem to move. "The castle is old," Mrs. Blackwood said, noting Maren's upward gaze. "Built in the time of King Edgar's grandfather. Lord Caleb's family has held these lands for centuries. And where might I find Lord Caleb?" Maren asked, setting down her small bundle of possessions. "He rests during the day," Mrs. Blackwood replied without meeting her eyes. "You will meet him at evening meal. For now, let me show you to your quarters and the kitchen where you'll work." They climbed a narrow stone staircase that wound upward through the castle's interior. Maren's legs protested after the long journey, but she forced herself to keep pace with the surprisingly spry housekeeper. They passed several floors before Mrs. Blackwood led her down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced nobles. "Your chambers," Mrs. Blackwood said, opening a heavy wooden door. The room was simple but clean. A narrow bed stood against one wall, covered with thick woolen blankets. A small fireplace occupied the opposite wall, with a wooden chair and table nearby. A single window looked out over the castle's inner courtyard. It was sparse, but it was more than she had possessed in weeks. "The kitchen is on the ground floor, Mrs. Blackwood continued. "I'll show you now, as you'll want to prepare this evening's meal." They descended back through the castle's maze of corridors. Maren noted the strange silence that seemed to permeate every stone. No servants bustled about, no voices echoed from distant rooms. Only the soft whisper of their footsteps and the occasional distant settling of ancient timbers. The kitchen, when they finally reached it, took Maren's breath away. It was enormous, clearly designed to feed a household of hundreds. Massive stone hearths dominated two walls, with iron spits large enough to roast whole oxen. Wooden tables, scarred by centuries of chopping and preparation, filled the center space. Copper pots and iron cauldrons hung from hooks, and shelves lined with ceramic jars and crocks stretched toward the vaulted ceiling. "It's been long unused to its full capacity, Mrs. Blackwood said with something that might have been sadness. "Lord Caleb dines simply these days, but he has particular requirements." Maren set her precious copper pot on one of the tables and turned to face the housekeeper fully. "What manner of requirements, Mrs.?" Blackwood hesitated, her fingers worrying at the fabric of her skirt. "He does not eat as other men do, but he remembers the taste of mortal food, and it brings him comfort. You must prepare meals as you would for any lord of a great house. He will taste them, and in that tasting he finds a brief respite from his burden." The words were carefully chosen, Maren realized. This woman was trying to tell her something without saying it directly. And what burden would that be? "Some questions are best answered by Lord Caleb himself," Mrs. Blackwood said firmly. "But I will tell you this, he is not what the stories make him seem. He is weary, Lady Maren, bone-deep weary in a way that sleep cannot cure. Your cooking, if it is as fine as your reputation suggests, may bring him a moment's peace." Maren nodded slowly. She had known weariness herself, the kind that settled into your bones and whispered that rest would never come. If cooking could ease such suffering, then she would cook. What would he prefer for this evening's meal? "Mrs." Blackwood's face brightened slightly. "Something simple, perhaps. A stew, fresh bread, maybe honeyed wine. Foods that speak of home and hearth." Home and hearth. Maren could do that. She had built a life around making such things. "I'll need to see what provisions you have." They spent the next hour exploring the castle's stores. The root cellars were well stocked with vegetables, the pantries filled with grains and preserved meats. A dairy house provided fresh milk and cream, and to Maren's surprise, she found herbs growing in a small garden protected by high walls. "Lord Caleb ensures we want for nothing in the way of provisions," Mrs. Blackwood explained. "He may be different, but he understands that a household must eat." As afternoon faded toward evening, Maren lost herself in the familiar rhythms of preparation. She chopped onions and carrots, their sharp scents filling the vast kitchen with life. She built fires in two of the great hearths, setting water to boil and warming iron pans. The beef stew she created was rich with herbs and wine, the way her grandmother had taught her when she was barely tall enough to reach the pot handles. Fresh bread dough rose in wooden bowls while she worked, and she shaped the loaves with practiced hands. The ovens built into the hearth walls were ancient but well-maintained, and they held heat beautifully. Soon the kitchen filled with the golden scent of baking bread. Mrs. Blackwood returned as Maren was ladling the stew into a ceramic bowl. The housekeeper had changed into a fresh dress and arranged her hair more carefully. "Lord Caleb will dine in his solar," she said. "I'll show you the way." They climbed yet another staircase, this one broader and carpeted with rich burgundy wool. The solar was a chamber at the top of the castle's main tower, with tall windows that looked out over the surrounding forest. Heavy curtains could be drawn across them, but for now they stood open to the evening sky. A table had been set, with simple pewter plates and goblets. Candles provided warm light, and a fire crackled in the hearth. It was comfortable in a way that the rest of the castle had not been lived in, personal. "Set the meal here, Mrs." Blackwood instructed, indicating the table. "Lord Caleb will join you shortly." "Join me?" Maren asked, startled. "He prefers to dine with company when possible. It's part of what makes the food meaningful to him." Mrs. Blackwood paused at the door. "Do not be afraid, Lady Maren. Whatever else he may be, Lord Caleb is a gentleman." And then she was gone, leaving Maren alone in the solar with her steaming stew and fresh bread. She arranged the meal carefully, adding a small crock of butter and a jar of honey she had found in the stores. The honeyed wine she had prepared sat in a pewter pitcher, warming by the fire. Outside the windows, full darkness was falling over the forest. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled long, mournful, and achingly lonely. Maren shivered despite the warmth of the fire. Footsteps echoed in the stairwell, measured, deliberate. Maren straightened her simple brown dress and smoothed her greying hair. Whatever came next, she would face it with the dignity her grandmother had taught her. A lady never cowered, regardless of circumstances. The solar door opened, and Lord Caleb stepped into the candlelight. Maren had expected a monster. She had prepared herself for glowing red eyes, fangs dripping with blood, perhaps claws that could tear flesh from bone. The stories told in taverns and whispered around hearth-fires had painted vivid pictures of supernatural horror. Instead, she found herself looking at a man. He was tall, certainly, with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe. His hair was dark as a moonless night, and hung just past his collar in waves that caught the candlelight. But his face was that of a nobleman in his prime, perhaps 35 years, with strong features and intelligent eyes, the color of winter storms. He wore simple black clothing, well-tailored but unadorned, and moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command. What struck her most was not his appearance, but his expression. She had expected arrogance, cruelty, perhaps madness. Instead, she saw surprise flickering across his features as he took in the sight of her standing beside his dining table. "Lady Maren," he said, and his voice was cultured, warm even. "Mrs. Blackwood told me you had arrived." She inclined her head in a respectful nod. "Lord Caleb, I've prepared your evening meal as requested." He moved closer to the table, and she caught a scent that puzzled her, not the corruption of death she had expected, but something like winter pine and old leather. Clean, masculine, oddly comforting. "Please, be seated," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his own. "Mrs. Blackwood was correct that I prefer company while dining." Maren settled into her chair, watching as he took his place across from her. He lifted the silver goblet that sat beside his plate, tarnished with age but still beautiful, and studied it for a moment before setting it aside. "Tell me," he said, ladling stew into his bowl with movements that were almost reverent. "What brought you to accept my rather unusual offer?" The directness of the question surprised her. She had expected polite small talk, perhaps some mysterious hints about his nature. "Necessity, my lord. I had little choice in the matter." He paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Ah, honesty. How refreshing." He tasted the stew, and his eyes closed briefly. When he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression, a softening, as if some long-held tension had eased. "This is extraordinary. The herbs, thyme and rosemary, and a touch of sage, my lord. My grandmother's recipe. Your grandmother must have been a wise woman." He took another spoonful, savoring it with an attention that seemed almost reverent. "How long has it been since you prepared such meals?" "Until 6 weeks ago, I ran an inn in Millbrook. Before that, I cooked for my own family." She watched him eat, noting how he seemed to concentrate on each bite, as if memorizing the taste. "May I ask why you require a cook, my lord, Mrs. Blackwood mentioned you have particular needs." Lord Caleb set down his spoon and reached for the bread she had baked. He tore off a piece and held it to his nose, breathing in the scent. "Food has become complicated for me, Lady Merrin. I can no longer sustain myself on mortal fare alone, but I remember its taste, its comfort. When I eat food prepared with skill and care, I remember what it was to be human." The admission hung in the air between them. Merrin absorbed his words, turning them over in her mind. "No longer sustain yourself on mortal fare," she repeated slowly. "Then the stories are true. You are what they say you are." "A vampire, yes." He said the word simply, without drama or apology. "Does that frighten you?" Merrin considered the question seriously. She studied his face, searching for signs of the predator she had been warned about. Instead, she saw a man who ate her stew as if it were a precious gift, who spoke of remembering humanity with a longing that resonated in her own heart. "I've buried 3 husbands and 5 children," she said finally. "I've watched disease ravage those I loved, seen poverty strip away dignity and hope. I've faced collectors who would have thrown me into the street without a second thought. You ask if you frighten me, Lord Caleb, but sitting here now, no, you don't frighten me." Something flickered in his storm-grey eyes. "Most would run screaming. Most haven't lived as long as I have." Merrin reached for her own bowl of stew. "Tell me, when did you last taste food that brought you comfort?" "Decades," he admitted, "perhaps longer. I had given up hope of finding someone who could." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Who could cook with love?" "Love?" The word surprised her. "Forgive me. I know how that must sound. But there's something in the way you prepare food, I can taste it. The care, the attention to detail, the desire to nourish and comfort. It's been so long since I experienced such a thing." Merrin set down her spoon and really looked at him. Beneath the aristocratic bearing and supernatural grace, she saw something achingly familiar: loneliness. The kind of bone-deep isolation she had known herself in the empty years after her youngest son's death. "What happened to you?" she asked gently. "How did you come to be as you are?" Lord Caleb's hand stilled on his goblet. "That is a long and painful tale, Lady Merrin, perhaps not suitable for a first evening's conversation. I've found that painful tales are often the most important ones to share." She refilled his bowl from the pot she had brought up. "But I won't press you. I'm here to cook, nothing more." "Nothing more," he repeated, and there was something almost wistful in his tone. "When was the last time you spoke with someone who didn't want something from you? Besides cooking, I mean." The question caught her off guard. She thought back through the months of struggle, the creditors and bill collectors, the neighbors who had helped only when they needed something in return. "I can't remember," she admitted. "Then perhaps we are both seeking the same thing, simple human connection without ulterior motive." He raised his goblet, though she noticed he never actually drank from it. To unexpected companionship, Merrin lifted her own cup of honeyed wine. To new beginnings, they ate in companionable silence for a while. Outside the windows, night had fully claimed the forest, and the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and Maren found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. "The bread is perfection," Lord Caleb said eventually, "light as air, with just the right amount of salt. You have a true gift. My grandmother taught me that bread is the foundation of any good meal. Get the bread right, and everything else follows." She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. She used to say that cooking was the closest thing to magic that ordinary people could practice. Taking simple ingredients and transforming them into something that nourishes both body and soul. Lord Caleb went very still. "Magic," he murmured. "Yes, I suppose it is. You speak as if you know something of magic yourself." His smile was rueful. "More than I ever wished to, I'm afraid." The conversation lapsed again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Maren found herself studying her employer, his precise movements, the way he seemed to savor each bite as if it might be his last, the profound sadness that seemed to emanate from him like a physical presence. "Lord Caleb," she said finally, "what exactly do you require of me during my service here?" "Precisely what you've done tonight. Prepare meals that speak of home, of comfort, of the life I once knew. Dine with me so that I'm not entirely alone with my thoughts. He hesitated. "Be human, Lady Maren. Be gloriously, beautifully human." The raw honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. "And in return, safety, comfort, compensation as promised. And perhaps, if you're willing, conversation with someone who will not judge you for the losses you've endured." Maren set down her cup and met his eyes directly. "I accept those terms, my lord." "Caleb," he said softly, "when we're alone like this, please call me Caleb. Then you must call me Maren." He smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger, more human somehow. "Very well, Maren. I believe this arrangement will suit us both admirably." As if summoned by some invisible signal, Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the doorway. "Shall I clear the table, my lord?" "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood, and please see that Lady Maren has everything she needs for tomorrow's preparations." Maren rose from her chair, gathering the empty bowls and platters. "What would you prefer for tomorrow evening's meal?" Caleb considered the question. "Something that reminds you of your happiest memory," he said finally, "whatever that might be." As she followed Mrs. Blackwood from the solar, Maren found herself already planning the next day's menu. But more than that, she found herself looking forward to the evening conversation that would follow. Whatever Lord Caleb truly was, whatever darkness surrounded him, he had shown her kindness and respect she hadn't experienced in years. Perhaps this strange arrangement would benefit them both more than either had dared to hope. The ancient castle began to reveal its rhythms to Maren over the following days. She woke each morning with the first light of dawn, when Caleb retreated to whatever chambers housed his daylight rest. The kitchen became her domain from sunrise to sunset, and she threw herself into the work with the dedication of someone who had found purpose again. Her recipe book, bound in cracked leather and filled with her grandmother's careful script alongside her own additions over the years, became her most precious possession in this strange new life. Each page held memories: the ginger biscuits her youngest son had loved, the hearty lamb stew that had sustained her family through harsh winters, the delicate fruit tarts she had served to travelling nobles in better days. Mrs. Blackwood proved to be an invaluable source of information about the castle's operations. The household, Maren learned, consisted of only a handful of servants: Mrs. Blackwood herself, a groundskeeper named Thomas, who maintained the gardens and livestock, and two young women named Sarah and Emma, who cleaned and mended and spoke little to strangers. "Lord Caleb prefers a small staff," Mrs. Blackwood explained as they inventoried the wine cellars together. "Too many people ask too many questions. Those who serve here have learned to accept what cannot be understood and value what can be appreciated." "And what can be appreciated?" Marin asked, running her finger along the dusty bottles that lined the stone walls. Security. Honest work. A master who pays fairly and never raises his voice in anger. Mrs. Blackwood selected a bottle of Burgundy and held it up to examine the label. Lord Caleb has been good to those who serve him faithfully. Whatever darkness may touch his life, he has never allowed it to corrupt his treatment of others. That evening, Marin prepared roasted chicken with herbs from the castle garden, accompanied by fresh vegetables and the same brown bread that had earned Caleb's praise the night before. She had spent extra time on the preparation, wanting to show that her first meal had not been merely beginner's luck. When she arrived at the solar with her laden tray, she found Caleb standing by the tall windows, gazing out at the star-filled sky. He had changed from his simple black attire into a deep blue doublet that brought out the stormy color of his eyes. "Good evening, Marin," he said, turning from the window with a smile that seemed more relaxed than it had the previous night. "Something smells extraordinary." "Roasted chicken with rosemary and thyme," she replied, setting down the tray and beginning to arrange the dishes. "And I found some excellent turnips in your root cellar." "You've managed to make turnips sound appealing," he said with genuine amusement. "That's a talent indeed." As they settled into their chairs, Marin found herself studying her employer more openly. In the dancing candlelight, his features seemed less sharp, more human. When he smiled, the effect was quite striking. "Tell me about your inn," he said, carving the chicken with practiced precision. "What was it like before?" He paused delicately. "Before it failed?" Marin finished. "It was called the Millbrook Inn, and it sat beside the main road between the capital and the eastern ports. For 20 years it thrived. Merchants, nobles, common travellers, all found welcome at our table. 20 years is a considerable achievement. What changed?" Marin sighed, accepting the portion of chicken he offered. "The new trade routes bypassed our village. Fewer travellers meant less income. When the fever came 3 years ago and took my youngest—" She paused, finding the words still difficult. "The physician's bills consumed what savings we had. After that, it was simply a matter of time." Caleb set down his knife and fork, his expression growing gentle. "I'm sorry for your loss. To lose a child is a pain I wouldn't wish on any parent." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. "You speak as if you know that pain yourself." For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked. She saw raw grief flash across his features before he regained control. "I had a daughter once, a very long time ago. What happened to her? She grew old and died, as mortal children do. As I could not." His voice was barely above a whisper. "She lived a full life, married well, gave me grandchildren I could never acknowledge. I watched her from a distance as she aged, always hiding what I had become. The curse that preserved my life robbed me of the right to be a father to her." Marin felt her heart clench with sympathy. "How long ago?" 2 centuries. Perhaps 3. Time becomes meaningless after the first 100 years. They ate in contemplative silence for several minutes. Marin found herself re-evaluating everything she thought she understood about vampires. The stories spoke of mindless predators, creatures driven by bloodlust and evil. They never mentioned fathers who mourned their children across centuries, or men who sought comfort in simple human connection. "Why do you dine with me?" she asked suddenly. "Surely you have better ways to spend your evenings than sitting with a widowed innkeeper." Caleb considered the question while sipping from his silver goblet which, she noticed, he still never actually drank from. "Do you know what the most difficult part of immortality is, Marin?" "I imagine there are many difficulties. The isolation," he said quietly. "Watching everyone you care about age and die while you remain unchanged. After the first century, most of us stop trying to form connections with mortals. The pain of loss becomes too great to bear repeatedly. But you invited me here. A moment of weakness, perhaps, or hope. I told myself I simply wanted someone who could cook food that reminded me of humanity. But if I'm honest, and your presence seems to inspire honesty, I was desperately lonely. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Maren reached for the wine pitcher and refilled both their cups. "I understand loneliness," she said simply. "After my husband died, after I lost my son, there were days when I spoke to no one but myself. The inn's common room would be empty for weeks at a time. I began to forget what my own voice sounded like. And yet you came here, to a place that must seem even more isolated than your inn." Maren smiled ruefully. "Sometimes a different kind of isolation is preferable to the familiar kind. At least here, I'm not surrounded by reminders of what I've lost." "No," Caleb agreed. "Here you're surrounded by reminders of what I've lost. I'm not certain that's an improvement. Perhaps it is, though. Perhaps we can help each other remember what we've gained, rather than dwelling on what we've lost." He studied her face in the candlelight, and she saw surprise in his expression. "You're a remarkable woman, Maren. I'm beginning to think Mrs. Blackwood was right about you." "What did she say?" "That you were exactly what this place needed. I thought she meant your cooking skills, but I suspect she meant something far more important." As Mrs. Blackwood arrived to clear the table, Caleb rose and moved to the window again. "Tomorrow evening, would you be willing to dine in the gardens? The weather should be pleasant, and I think you might enjoy seeing the castle by moonlight." Maren felt an unexpected flutter of pleasure at the suggestion. "I would like that very much." "Excellent. I'll have Thomas prepare a table near the herb garden. You can inspect your ingredients while we eat." After the dishes were cleared and she had bid Caleb good night, Maren returned to her chambers with a lightness in her step that had been absent for months. She pulled her recipe book from her small bundle of belongings and settled by the window to plan the next day's menu. For the first time since accepting this position, she found herself looking forward not just to the cooking, but to the conversation that would follow. Caleb was nothing like what she had expected, and their growing friendship was becoming the most interesting part of her new life. Perhaps Mrs. Blackwood had been right. Perhaps they were both exactly what the other needed. The castle gardens revealed themselves to be far more beautiful than Maren had imagined. By moonlight, they possessed an otherworldly quality that took her breath away. Ancient roses climbed stone walls in cascading waterfalls of white and deep crimson, their perfume heavy in the cool night air. Lavender and rosemary grew in neat rows beside more exotic herbs she couldn't identify, and fruit trees heavy with autumn apples created natural alcoves throughout the space. Thomas had arranged a small table beneath an arbor where grapevines formed a natural canopy overhead. Candles in glass lanterns provided gentle illumination, and the setting felt intimate in a way that made Maren's pulse quicken unexpectedly. "This is extraordinary," she said as Caleb appeared beside her, moving with that fluid grace that still caught her off guard. "I had no idea such beauty existed within these walls. My mother designed these gardens," he replied, pulling out her chair with courtly manners that spoke of centuries of practice. "She believed that even the darkest places needed spots of light and beauty to sustain the soul." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Caleb settled across from her, and in the soft candlelight his features seemed less sharp, more human than ever. "She died when I was still mortal, but I've maintained her gardens as she would have wanted. It's one of the few connections I have left to the man I used to be." Maren had prepared lamb stew tonight, rich with wine and herbs, accompanied by crusty bread and early pears from the orchard. But as she served the meal, she found herself more interested in the man across from her than the food she had spent hours perfecting. "Tell me about the man you used to be," she said gently. Caleb paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth, and for a moment she thought he might deflect the question as he had others. But then he set down his utensil and looked directly at her. "I was Lord Caleb Ravenscroft, eldest son and heir to considerable lands. I was 32 when I was turned, married to a woman I adored, father to a daughter who was the light of my existence. His voice grew soft with memory. I thought I understood what life was about: duty, family, legacy. I believed I would grow old, surrounded by grandchildren, die peacefully in the bed where I was born. What changed that? A woman, he said with bitter irony. A beautiful ancient creature who decided she wanted a companion for eternity. She gave me no choice in the matter. Maren felt anger flare in her chest at the casual way he spoke of such violation. She forced this curse upon you? Vampirism is not always the romantic seduction that bards sing about, Caleb said grimly. Sometimes it's simply a powerful predator taking what they want. I fought her, but mortal strength is nothing against supernatural power. When I woke 3 days later, my wife was already planning my funeral. Your wife believed you dead. I was dead, in every way that mattered. The man she married, the father my daughter knew, he died that night. What remained was something else entirely. Caleb reached for his goblet, his movements sharp with remembered pain. I tried to return to them, to explain what had happened. But how do you tell your family that you're now a creature that must feed on blood to survive? How do you hold your child when your touch is cold as winter stone? So you left them. I watched from a distance as they mourned me. I saw my wife struggle to manage the estates alone, watched my daughter grow up without her father. It was... He stopped, his jaw working as he fought for control. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done, and I've had centuries to accumulate difficult experiences. Without thinking, Maren reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. His skin was indeed cold, but not unnaturally so, like someone who had been walking in winter air. I'm sorry. No one should have to endure such loss. He stared down at their joined hands with an expression of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was touching him voluntarily. You're not afraid? Should I be? Most would recoil from the touch of a monster. Maren tightened her grip on his hand. I don't see a monster, Caleb. I see a man who has suffered more than anyone should have to bear. Something shifted in his expression: surprise, gratitude, and beneath it all, a vulnerability that made her chest ache. How is it that you see so clearly what others cannot? Perhaps because I know something about loss myself. When my youngest died, I thought my heart would stop beating from the sheer pain of it. There were days when I wished it would. The only thing that kept me going was knowing that he would have wanted me to continue living. Did it get easier? The pain changes, she said honestly. It becomes less sharp, but more constant. Like a stone you carry in your chest, you learn to live with the weight, but it never truly goes away. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, her hand still resting over his. Around them, the garden whispered with night sounds, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the gentle splash of water from a hidden fountain. Maren, Caleb said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. When was the last time someone touched you with kindness? The question caught her off guard. She thought back through the long months of struggle, the cold transactions with creditors, the pitying glances from neighbors. I can't remember, she admitted. Nor can I, he said. It's been decades at least. Centuries, perhaps. She studied his face in the flickering candlelight, noting the way his eyes had softened, the tension that seemed to have eased from his shoulders. This was dangerous territory, she realized. They were both lonely people finding comfort in each other's presence, and that was a recipe for complications she wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. But when he turned his hand palm up beneath hers and gently intertwined their fingers, she didn't pull away. We should probably discuss the practical arrangements of my employment, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Probably, he agreed, but made no move to release her hand. My duties, my schedule, the expectations. Your only duty is to be yourself, he interrupted gently, to cook with the love and care that makes your food so extraordinary. To sit with me in the evenings and remind me that conversation can be a pleasure rather than a burden. And if I choose to do more than that? The question surprised them both. Merrin hadn't intended to voice it, but there it was, hanging in the perfumed air between them. "Then I would consider myself the most fortunate of men," Caleb said quietly. "But I would never presume to ask for more than you're willing to give." When Mrs. Blackwood appeared to clear the table, she found them still sitting hand in hand beneath the grapevine arbor, talking quietly about their shared past losses and unexpected present hopes. If the housekeeper found anything unusual about the scene, she gave no sign, simply going about her duties with practiced discretion. As they finally rose to return to the castle, Caleb offered Merrin his arm. "Thank you," he said as they walked slowly back toward the main building. "For listening, for understanding, for treating you like a man rather than a monster." "Yes," he said simply. "It's been a very long time since anyone saw me as anything more than a creature to be feared." "Then they weren't looking hard enough," Merrin replied, and was rewarded with one of his rare, genuine smiles. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt almost like domestic harmony. Merrin found herself anticipating their evening meals with an eagerness that had nothing to do with her culinary pride and everything to do with the man who sat across from her each night. Their conversations had deepened beyond polite exchanges, becoming something approaching true friendship, though both were careful not to name the growing warmth between them. Tonight, Caleb had appeared in the solar carrying a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by centuries of handling. He set it carefully on the table beside the venison roast Merrin had prepared, his movements unusually hesitant. "I thought you might like to see something," he said, settling into his chair. "Since you've shared so many stories of your family, I wondered if you'd care to see what remains of mine." Merrin's hands stilled over the serving dishes. "Are you certain? I wouldn't want to intrude on private memories." "They're not private anymore," he said with a slight smile. "Not from you. You've earned the right to know who I was before this." He opened the box with reverent care, revealing a collection of small treasures nestled in faded silk. A child's wooden toy horse, painted in bright blue and gold. A woman's glove, delicate lace now yellowed with age. And nestled in the center, a locket of tarnished silver, its chain dark with time. "My daughter's first toy," he said, lifting the horse. "She carried it everywhere until she was 7 years old. My wife, Eleanor, she tried to convince Lyanna to leave it behind when we visited court, but our daughter would hide it in her sleeve." "Lyanna," Merrin repeated softly. "A beautiful name. She was a beautiful child, spirited, intelligent, stubborn as her mother." Caleb's voice held a warmth she had never heard before. "She had Eleanor's golden hair and my grey eyes, and she could charm her way out of any mischief she caused." He sat down the toy and picked up the locket, opening it with a careful touch. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her blonde hair arranged in the fashion of centuries past. "Eleanor," he said simply. "Painted on our wedding day. She was 19, the daughter of a neighboring lord. Our marriage was arranged, but we were fortunate. We grew to love each other deeply." Merrin leaned closer to study the portrait. "She looks lovely and kind. She was both. Patient with my quick temper, wise beyond her years, devoted to our people. She would have made a better lord than I ever did." Caleb's thumb traced the edge of the locket. "I used to wonder if she could have found happiness with another man after my death. She was young enough, beautiful enough, but she never remarried. Perhaps she loved you too much to consider it. Perhaps, or perhaps she was too busy managing the estates and raising our daughter alone." His voice carried the weight of old guilt. "I left her with so much responsibility, so many burdens." Merrin reached across the table and gently touched the locket. "May I ask what happened to them? How did their stories end?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the portrait. "Eleanor died of a fever when she was 43. Lyanna was grown by then, married to a good man who helped manage the estates. She lived to be 78, a long life for those times. She had 5 children of her own, a dozen grandchildren. You watched over them." "From a distance, I made sure they wanted for nothing, that the lands remained prosperous, that threats were dealt with before they could cause harm. But I could never approach them directly. The risk was too great. What risk? That they would see what I had become, that I would bring danger to their door. Caleb closed the locket with a soft click. Vampires have enemies, Maren. Those who hunt us, who would use our loved ones against us. My family was safer believing me dead. Maren absorbed this, understanding now why he lived in such isolation. But surely they would have wanted to know you were alive, even if you were changed? Would they? How do you tell your daughter that her father now sustains himself on blood? How do you hold your grandchildren when you know you could lose control and harm them? He shook his head. I made the choice to protect them from what I had become. Right or wrong, it's a decision I've had to live with for centuries. And you've been alone all this time? Mostly. I've encountered other vampires over the years, but they're not. He paused, searching for words. They're not the kind of companions I sought. Most have embraced the darker aspects of our nature. They see humans as prey, nothing more. But you don't. No. I remember being human too clearly to view mortals as mere food sources. I feed when I must, but I choose those who won't be missed criminals, those who prey on the innocent. I never take more than necessary, never kill unless there's no alternative. Maren felt something shift in her understanding of him. That must be terribly difficult, fighting your nature constantly. It is, he admitted. But the alternative, becoming the monster that stories make us out to be, that would be a betrayal of everything Eleanor and Lyanna meant to me. She watched him carefully replace the treasures in their box, noting the reverence with which he handled each item. Is that why you asked me here? To remember what it felt like to be human? Partly. He closed the box and met her eyes directly. But also because something about you reminds me that humanity isn't just about mortality. It's about compassion, kindness, the ability to see good in others even when they can't see it in themselves. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. I'm nothing special, Caleb. Just a widow trying to make the best of circumstances beyond my control. You're extraordinary, he said quietly. You came to a vampire's castle without fear, treated a monster as a man, brought light and warmth to a place that has known only shadows for centuries. If that's not special, I don't know what is. Their eyes held across the table, and Maren felt the air between them grow charged with unspoken possibilities. This was more than friendship now, more than employer and servant. They were two damaged souls, finding healing in each other's presence. Caleb, she said softly, what are we doing? I don't know, he admitted. All I know is that when I'm with you, I remember what it felt like to be alive. Not just existing, but truly living. Is that enough? Can it be enough? He reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. For now, it's more than I ever dared hope for. The change in their relationship did not go unnoticed by the castle's small household. Mrs. Blackwood began setting the solar table with Eleanor's fine china instead of simple pewter, and fresh flowers appeared daily in Maren's chambers. Thomas tended the herb garden with extra care, ensuring she always had the finest ingredients for her cooking. Even the young maids, Sarah and Emma, seemed to move with lighter steps through the corridors. But with the growing warmth came growing danger. Caleb became increasingly restless as autumn deepened toward winter, often standing at the solar windows long into the night, his jaw tight with tension. Maren didn't understand. There are riders on the roads, he said one evening, abandoning his meal to pace before the fireplace. I've seen their campfires in the distance, heard their horses in the valley below. Maren set down her fork, noting the sharp edge in his voice. What kind of riders? The kind that hunt creatures like me. He turned from the fire, and she saw something she had never seen in his eyes before, genuine fear. Vampire hunters, Maren. They've been tracking something, or someone, and their trail leads toward Ravencroft. Could they be after you specifically? It's possible. I've tried to live quietly, to avoid drawing attention, but 3 centuries of existence leaves traces. Some hunters are very good at following old patterns, old stories. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that had become familiar to her. What concerns me more is that they may not care about the distinction between guilty and innocent. Some hunters kill anyone they find in a vampire's domain. The implication hit her like a physical blow. You're afraid for me. Terrified for you, he corrected, the admission raw and honest. Maren, you should leave. Tonight, I can arrange for Mrs. Blackwood to escort you to the nearest town, provide you with enough coin to establish yourself somewhere safe. The suggestion sparked immediate anger in her chest. Absolutely not. This isn't a request, and this isn't a negotiation. Maren rose from her chair, moving to face him directly. I won't be driven away by the possibility of danger. This isn't possibility, it's certainty. These men won't hesitate to kill you simply for being here. Then they'll have to get through you first, won't they? Caleb went very still. You can't mean that. I mean every word. Maren reached up and cupped his face in her hands, noting how he leaned into the touch despite his agitation. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. You don't understand what you're saying. These aren't common bandits or local troublemakers. These are trained killers who specialize in hunting supernatural creatures. They carry blessed weapons, know our weaknesses, have methods of... Stop. Her thumb traced along his cheekbone, and she felt him shudder at the gentle contact. I've made my choice, Caleb. I'm staying. Why? The word was barely a whisper. Why would you risk your life for someone like me? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither had been brave enough to voice. Maren looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw her own growing feelings reflected there, affection that had deepened into something far more dangerous than either had intended. Because, she said quietly, somewhere along the way I stopped thinking of this as temporary employment and started thinking of it as home. The effect of her words on him was immediate and profound. His hands came up to cover hers where they rested against his face, his eyes closing as if her touch caused him physical pain. Maren, he breathed, you can't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. She stepped closer until they were sharing breath in the firelight. I know that for the first time in years, I look forward to tomorrow. I know that your smile has become the best part of my day. I know that the thought of leaving you... He kissed her then, cutting off her words with a desperate hunger that spoke of centuries of loneliness, finally finding relief. His lips were cool but warmed quickly under hers, and when she responded with equal fervor, he made a sound deep in his throat that was part relief, part anguish. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face. This is madness, he whispered. I'm a monster, Maren, a creature of darkness who shouldn't be touching something as pure as you. You're a man, she corrected firmly. A good man who's endured more than anyone should have to bear, and you're mine. The possessiveness in her voice seemed to undo something in him. He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you. Deserve has nothing to do with it. Maren held him tightly, feeling the tension that thrummed through his supernatural strength. We found each other, Caleb. Against all odds, in this unlikely place, we found each other. I won't let hunters or fear or anything else take that away. They stood there for long minutes, holding each other in the dancing firelight. Around them, the castle seemed to hold its breath, as if even the ancient stones recognized the significance of this moment. If you stay, Caleb said eventually, his voice muffled against her hair, I'll do everything in my power to protect you. But you need to understand if these hunters come for us, I may have to do things you've never seen. The man you've come to know, the gentle companion who sits with you at dinner, he may have to become something else entirely. Maren pulled back to look at him directly. Will you still be you underneath it all? I don't know. When the bloodlust takes hold, When survival becomes the only imperative, I can't promise I'll remain the man you think I am. Then I'll have to trust that the man I've fallen in love with is stronger than the monster he fears. Becoming. The words slipped out before she could stop them, hanging in the air like a challenge to fate itself. Caleb's eyes widened with shock and something that looked like desperate hope. "Love?" he repeated, the word sounding foreign on his lips. "Yes," she said simply. "Love. Inconvenient, impossible, dangerous love that makes me willing to face vampire hunters rather than lose what we've found together." He kissed her again then, and this time there was nothing desperate about it. This kiss spoke of promises made and accepted, of two souls choosing each other against all reason and consequence. When Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the doorway to clear the table, she found them standing together in the firelight, holding each other as if they could ward off all the darkness in the world through sheer force of will. Perhaps they could. The attack came not with the thunder of hooves or the crash of splintered gates, but with the quiet poison of betrayal served at dinner. Maren had prepared Caleb's favorite meal, braised beef with wine and herbs, accompanied by the brown bread that had become their evening ritual. She had taken extra care with the preparation, wanting to create something comforting in the face of the growing tension that had settled over the castle like a shroud. Caleb seemed more relaxed than he had in days as they settled at their table in the solar. The wine she served was from his finest vintage, a Burgundy that had aged in the castle's cellars for decades. He lifted his silver goblet, the one artifact from his mortal life that he still used regularly, and took a deeper drink than usual. "The vintage is exceptional tonight," he said, savoring the taste. "It reminds me of—" He stopped mid-sentence, his hand freezing on the goblet's handle. A strange expression crossed his features. Confusion followed quickly by alarm. "Maren," he said, his voice already growing thick. "Something's wrong." The goblet slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor and spilling dark wine across the stone like spilled blood. Caleb gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white with strain. "What's happening?" Maren was on her feet instantly, moving to his side. "The wine!" he gasped. "There's something in the wine." Even as he spoke, she could see the change taking hold. His supernatural grace was failing, his movements becoming clumsy and labored. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the coolness of his undead flesh. "Mrs. Blackwood," Maren called, but even as the name left her lips, she realized the futility. If someone had poisoned the wine, it had to be someone with access to the castle's stores, someone trusted enough to move freely through their sanctuary. Not Mrs. Blackwood. Caleb managed, his breathing becoming increasingly difficult. "She's been faithful for 50 years. Then who? The answer came from the Solar's doorway, where a figure stepped out of the shadows with practiced stealth. It was Thomas, the groundskeeper, but not the quiet, reliable man Maren had come to know. This Thomas held himself with the confidence of a trained killer, and his eyes held none of the simple honesty she had grown accustomed to. "Wolf's bane and blessed silver shavings," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Dissolved in holy water and added to your precious wine. It won't kill you, Lord Caleb, but it will weaken you considerably." "Thomas," Maren breathed, unable to process what she was seeing. "Why?" "Because 40 pieces of silver is more than I could earn in a lifetime tending gardens," he replied with a casual shrug. "The Hunters Guild pays well for information about vampire strongholds." Caleb tried to rise from his chair but stumbled, his legs no longer able to support his weight. Maren caught him, feeling the tremor that ran through his powerful frame. "How long?" Caleb asked through gritted teeth. "How long have you been spying?" 3 years, Thomas admitted, ever since the Guild learned that someone was protecting the trade routes through this region, ensuring that certain criminals met unfortunate ends. It took time to trace the pattern back to Ravencroft, and more time to get someone placed inside your household. "Mrs. Blackwood trusted you," Maren said, anger flaring hot in her chest. "We all trusted you." Mrs. Blackwood is a sentimental old woman who sees good where there is only expedience, Thomas replied. And you, Lady Maren, are an unexpected complication that my employers are eager to resolve. What do you mean? They know about your relationship with the vampire. They know you've chosen to stay despite understanding his nature. That makes you either a traitor to your own species or a victim under supernatural influence. His smile was cold as winter stone. Either way, they consider you compromised beyond redemption. The casual way he spoke of her death sent ice through Maren's veins, but her fear was not for herself. It was for the man struggling to remain conscious in her arms, weakened by poison and betrayal. "The hunters are coming tonight, aren't they?" she asked. "They're already here," Thomas confirmed. "Surrounding the castle as we speak. The poison was simply meant to ensure that Lord Caleb couldn't put up his usual fight. They prefer to take vampires alive. When possible, there are questions they want answered, information they need extracted." Caleb's head lifted with obvious effort, and when he spoke, his voice carried the edge of steel despite his weakness. "You have no idea what you've done, Thomas. The hunters you've allied yourself with, they're not the righteous protectors you believe them to be. They're cleansing the world of monsters. They're murderers who use holy mission as justification for cruelty." Caleb's breathing was labored, but his eyes burned with fury. "I've encountered their kind before. They don't stop with vampires. Anyone who associates with supernatural creatures, anyone who shows them mercy or kindness, all are considered tainted." Pretty words from a creature of evil. "Look at him," Maren said suddenly, her voice ringing with conviction. "Really look at him, Thomas. You've served in this household for 3 years. Have you ever seen him harm an innocent? Have you ever witnessed cruelty or evil?" For a moment something flickered in Thomas's expression, uncertainty, perhaps even doubt. But it passed quickly, replaced by stubborn certainty. He's a vampire. His very nature is evil. "His nature is what he chooses to make it," Maren replied firmly, "just as yours is what you choose to make it. And you've chosen betrayal." The sound of splintering wood echoed from somewhere far below in the castle. The hunters had breached the main gates. "They're inside," Thomas said with satisfaction. "It won't be long now." Caleb struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on Maren's support. The wolfsbane had weakened him severely, but she could feel the determination that thrummed through his supernatural frame. "Maren," he said, quietly, his voice for her ears alone. "There's a passage behind the tapestry, leads to the old chapel. Mrs. Blackwood knows the way. Find her, get out of here. I'm not leaving you. You have to. You can't help me like this, and if they capture you—" "No." Her voice was absolute, brooking no argument. "We face this together or not at all." Thomas laughed, the sound harsh in the candlelit chamber. "How touching. The human chooses to die with her monster. The hunters will find this quite instructive." Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the solar. The hunters were close now, drawn by Thomas's signal, or simply methodically searching the castle room by room. "There is another option," Caleb said suddenly, his eyes meeting Maren's with desperate intensity. "But it's dangerous, and I can't guarantee. Tell me, the old chapel. There are items there, artifacts that might help level the playing field. But getting there means fighting our way through armed hunters while I can barely stand." "Then we fight," Maren said simply. "Together." She moved to the fireplace and seized an iron poker, testing its weight in her hands. It wasn't much against trained killers, but it was better than facing them empty-handed. "You're both insane," Thomas said, but she heard uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time. "You can't fight professional hunters." "Watch us," Maren replied. The solar door burst open, revealing 3 men in dark leather armor marked with silver crosses. They moved with military precision, weapons drawn and ready. Lord Caleb Ravencroft. Their leader called out, his voice echoing with fanatic conviction. By order of the sacred hunt, you are hereby." His words were cut short as Marin hurled a heavy pewter candlestick at his head with surprising accuracy. As he stumbled backward, Caleb gathered his remaining strength and launched himself forward with supernatural speed, despite the poison weakening his system. The battle for Ravencroft Castle had begun. The hunter Marin had struck with the candlestick, recovered faster than she had hoped, but not before Caleb managed to disarm one of his companions, despite his weakened state. The solar erupted into chaos as furniture overturned and weapons clashed in the confined space. "The passage!" Caleb shouted, gesturing toward the tapestry that hung behind his chair. "Now!" Marin didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy tapestry and yanked it aside, revealing a narrow stone doorway that had been concealed for centuries. Cool air rushed out, carrying the scent of old stone and forgotten spaces. Caleb stumbled toward her, one hand pressed against a bleeding gash on his arm, while the other clutched a hunter's sword he had managed to claim. The wolfsbane was still coursing through his system, making his movements clumsy and his breathing labored. "Go," he gasped. "I'll hold them." "Together," Marin said firmly, catching his arm and pulling him toward the passage. "We do this together or not at all." Behind them, the hunters were regrouping, shouting orders in voices trained by military discipline. Thomas's voice rose above the others, directing them toward the hidden passage with the knowledge only a long-time servant would possess. The passage was narrow and steep, winding downward through the castle's ancient bones. Marin led the way, her hands pressed against the rough stone walls for guidance in the near-total darkness. Behind her, she could hear Caleb's labored breathing and the distant sounds of pursuit. "Where does this lead?" she asked, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "The old chapel," Caleb replied, his voice strained. "Built before the main castle, when my family first claimed these lands. It's been abandoned for decades. But what? But it contains things that might help us survive the night." They descended in relative silence after that, conserving breath and energy for whatever lay ahead. The passage seemed to go on forever, spiraling deeper into the earth beneath the castle. Finally, Marin saw a faint glow ahead, not electric light, but the warm flicker of candles or torches. The passage opened into a vaulted chamber that took Marin's breath away. The old chapel was smaller than the castle's current halls, but far more beautiful. Stained glass windows caught moonlight and threw colored patterns across stone floors worn smooth by centuries of worship. Ancient pews sat before an altar carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the flickering light. But what drew her attention immediately were the weapons that lined the walls, swords and crossbows, shields and armor, all marked with the same silver inlay that decorated the hunter's gear. Yet these pieces felt different, older, more purposeful, touched by something beyond mere craftsmanship. She breathed. "My ancestors were not ordinary nobles," Caleb confirmed, moving toward the weapons with renewed purpose. Despite the poison weakening him, his eyes held a fierce light she had never seen before. "We were sworn protectors, guardians against threats both mortal and supernatural. Before I was turned, I knew how to fight creatures like what I became." He selected a sword from the wall, its blade gleaming despite its obvious age. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt, he seemed to stand straighter, some of his natural grace returning despite the wolfsbane in his system. "These weapons are blessed," he continued, choosing a crossbow and testing its string. "But not with the blind hatred the hunters carry. They're blessed with purpose, to protect the innocent, to stand against true evil, to preserve the balance between light and dark." Marin reached for a smaller sword, surprised by how perfectly it fit her hand. "You think they'll work against the hunters? I think they'll work for anyone who wields them with righteous intent." Caleb's smile was grim but determined. "And defending one's home and loved ones certainly qualifies." The sound of footsteps echoed from the passage they had just used. Their pursuers had found the entrance and were making their way down the winding stairs. How many hunters are we facing? Maren asked, strapping the sword to her side and selecting a crossbow of her own. Thomas mentioned surrounding the castle, which suggests at least a dozen. Professional teams usually work in groups of 3 to 5, so we're probably looking at 15 to 20 trained killers. Against 2 of us, one of whom is poisoned. Against 2 of us, who have every reason to fight and nothing left to lose, Caleb corrected. That counts for more than numbers, especially when we know this castle and they don't. He moved to the altar and pressed a hidden mechanism. Part of the floor slid aside, revealing a cache of supplies that made Maren's eyes widen. Oil for fires, caltrops to scatter on floors, even what looked like primitive explosives. Your ancestors were very thorough, she observed. They had to be. This region has always attracted things that hunt in the darkness. Not all of them supernatural, not all of them evil, but all of them dangerous to innocent people. Caleb began stuffing supplies into a leather satchel, his movements becoming more fluid as adrenaline and purpose overcame the poison's effects. There are passages throughout the castle that only family members know. We can move unseen, strike where they don't expect us, make them pay for every room they try to take. What about Mrs. Blackwood and the girls? Sarah and Emma? There's a safe room in the lower levels. Mrs. Blackwood knows to take them there at the first sign of trouble. It's protected by wards that will hide them from supernatural detection and steel doors that will stop mortal weapons. The footsteps in the passage were getting closer. Maren could hear voices now harsh, professional tones discussing strategy and tactics. "We need to move," Caleb said, slinging his satchel across his shoulder. "There's another passage behind the altar that leads to the lower armory. We can gather more supplies, then begin picking them off one by one." "What about Thomas?" Caleb's expression hardened. Thomas made his choice when he took the hunter's silver. He forfeited any claim to mercy when he put you in danger. The venom in his voice reminded Maren that beneath the gentleman who shared dinner with her each night lay a predator with centuries of experience in violence. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel safer than she had since this nightmare began. "Lead the way," she said simply. They slipped through the concealed passage behind the altar, just as the first hunter emerged into the chapel. Maren heard him curse as he discovered the empty chamber, then bark orders to his companions to spread out and search for other exits. The new passage was wider than the first, clearly designed for quick movement rather than concealment. They moved through it at a steady pace, Caleb's supernatural senses alert for any sign of pursuit or ambush. "Maren," he said as they walked, "I need you to understand something about what's going to happen tonight. I'm listening. When the fighting truly begins, I may have to embrace aspects of my nature that I've spent centuries suppressing. The bloodlust, the predatory instincts, the willingness to kill without hesitation." He paused, his voice growing quiet. "I may become someone you don't recognize. Will you still be you underneath it all? I don't know. I hope so. But if I lose myself in the violence, if the monster takes control, then I'll bring you back." Maren's voice carried absolute certainty. "Whatever you become, however dark the path gets, I'll be there to remind you who you really are." They reached another hidden door, this one opening into the castle's lower armory. The chamber beyond was larger than the chapel, filled with weapons and armor enough to outfit a small army. Clearly, Caleb's ancestors had been prepared for siege warfare. "How long do we have before they find us here?" Maren asked, selecting a quiver of crossbow bolts and testing their points. "Not long. Thomas knows about most of the castle's secrets, though not all. He'll guide them to the obvious hiding places first." Caleb was filling a second satchel with oil bombs and other incendiaries. "We have maybe an hour before they corner us completely. Then we'd better make it count." Above them, muffled by stone and distance, they could hear the hunters spreading through the castle. Doors crashed open, furniture overturned, voices called out coordinates and search patterns. the methodical destruction of the sanctuary they had built together. "They're defiling our home," Maren said, anger building in her chest like a physical heat. "Yes," Caleb agreed, and when she looked at him, she saw that the poison's effects were finally beginning to fade. His eyes held a predatory gleam that should have frightened her, but instead filled her with fierce satisfaction. "And they're going to pay dearly for that mistake." He moved to a final weapons rack and selected a blade that was clearly different from the others. This sword was ancient beyond measure, its steel dark with age but still holding a razor edge. Intricate silver inlay covered the crossguard and pommel, forming symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "My great-grandfather's sword," he said simply. "Forged to kill monsters." "Ironic, isn't it?" "Not ironic," Maren corrected. "Perfect. Tonight, we use it to kill the real monsters, the ones who hunt love and call it righteousness. The first hunter died in the castle's wine cellars, Thomas's silver-bought knowledge leading him directly into Caleb's trap. The man never saw the blade that opened his throat, never heard the whisper of movement that announced his death. One moment he was methodically searching behind wine casks, the next he was crumpling to the cold stone floor. Maren watched from the shadows as Caleb emerged from his hiding place, the ancient sword dark with blood. The wolfsbane had finally worked its way out of his system, and the predator moved with fluid grace once more. But when he turned to her, his eyes still held warmth beneath the deadly focus. "One down," he said quietly, cleaning his blade on the dead hunter's cloak. "But they'll notice when he fails to report in." "How long before they find the body?" "Minutes, perhaps less. They're professionals. They'll have check-in protocols, search patterns, contingency plans." Caleb moved to the cellar's narrow windows, peering out at the moonlit courtyard beyond. "We need to hit them again before they can regroup." Through the thick glass, Maren could see moving shadows as hunters positioned themselves around the castle's perimeter. Burning arrows streaked through the darkness, their flaming heads embedding in wooden shutters and thatch. Soon, orange light began to flicker from upper windows as fires took hold. "They're trying to burn us out," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Standard siege tactics. Make the structure uninhabitable. Force the defenders into the open where they can be surrounded and overwhelmed." Caleb's expression was grim. "But they've made a tactical error. This castle has survived worse than fire." As if summoned by his words, the sound of running water began to echo through the cellars. Hidden mechanisms activated throughout the castle's walls, ancient engineering designed to channel water from the mountain springs directly into defensive systems. The fires above began to hiss and steam as cascading water extinguished them before they could spread. "Your ancestors thought of everything," Maren observed. "They had to. This was a dangerous frontier in their time." Caleb moved toward a different section of the cellar, where stone stairs wound upward toward the main floors. "The hunters will realize their fire attack failed soon enough. Then they'll try direct assault." They climbed carefully, weapons ready, senses alert for any sign of ambush. The castle felt different now, no longer a sanctuary but a battlefield where every shadow might conceal death. Their footsteps echoed strangely in corridors they had walked together in peace just hours before. "The kitchen," Caleb said suddenly. "They'll search there next. It's the heart of any household, likely to contain supplies or hiding places. Then that's where we'll wait for them." They reached the kitchen to find it in shambles. The hunters had overturned tables, smashed crockery, scattered flour and spices across the floor in their search for hidden passages or weapons. Maren's precious copper pot lay dented in one corner, and the sight of it damaged sent fresh rage coursing through her veins. "This was our place," she said, voice shaking with fury. "Where we shared meals, where we fell in love," Caleb finished softly. "Yes, and they'll pay for desecrating it." He positioned himself behind the massive central hearth, while Maren took cover near the pantry entrance. The kitchen's multiple doorways would force the hunters to split their attention, giving them opportunities for crossfire. They didn't have long to wait. Heavy footsteps announced the hunter's approach, along with the harsh whisper of drawn steel. 3 men entered through the main door, moving in military formation, while 2 more came through the servants' entrance. Maren's crossbow bolt took the lead hunter in the chest before he could raise his weapon. The blessed bolt punched through his leather armor as if it were cloth, spinning him around to crash into his companions. Caleb erupted from behind the hearth like a force of nature, his ancient sword cleaving through chainmail and bone with supernatural strength. The hunter's scream cut off abruptly as his head separated from his shoulders. The remaining 3 hunters rallied quickly, their training overcoming shock. Silver-blessed blades flashed in the candlelight as they converged on Caleb from 2 directions. But the vampire had centuries of combat experience, and the familiar weight of his ancestor's sword felt like coming home. Maren reloaded her crossbow with practiced efficiency, a skill learned from necessity during the lean years when hunting supplemented her inn's failing income. Her second shot caught a hunter in the shoulder, spinning him around just as Caleb's sword opened his throat. 2 left, Caleb called out, parrying a desperate thrust from one of the survivors. But even as he spoke, more footsteps echoed in the corridors beyond. The hunters were converging on their position, drawn by the sounds of combat. "We can't hold them here," Maren said, reaching for her sword as the crossbow became too clumsy for close quarters. "The Great Hall," Caleb replied, driving his blade through the final hunter's heart. "Better defensible positions, more room to maneuver." They gathered what supplies they could carry and retreated toward the castle's heart, leaving behind the kitchen that had been their sanctuary. Behind them, the sound of running boots announced pursuit. The battle for Ravencroft was far from over, but they had drawn first blood and proven that even professional killers could die when facing those who fought for love rather than coin. The Great Hall became their final battleground, its soaring ceiling and ancient tapestries bearing witness to a fight that would determine not just their survival, but the fate of the love they had discovered in this unlikely place. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, casting everything in silver and shadow, while the remaining hunters pressed their attack. Thomas led them now, his betrayal complete, as he guided the killers through corridors he had walked peacefully for 3 years. But his face showed none of the simple satisfaction Maren had expected. Instead, she saw doubt warring with desperate determination, as if he was trying to convince himself that this slaughter was justified. "Lord Caleb," Thomas called out across the hall, "surrender now, and the woman lives. Continue this futile resistance, and we'll make her death last for days." Caleb's response was a snarl of pure rage that echoed off the stone walls. The sound was more animal than human, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Maren saw the monster the stories warned about. But she wasn't afraid, she was proud. This creature of supernatural fury was fighting for her, and that knowledge filled her with fierce joy. The remaining hunters spread out across the hall, their movements coordinated and professional despite their losses. 7 men remained, each carrying blessed silver weapons and the confidence of those trained to kill the supernatural. They should have been enough to overwhelm 2 desperate defenders. They had not counted on the power of love transformed into protective rage. Caleb moved like liquid death, his ancestor's sword singing through the air as it carved through armor and flesh. The centuries of restraint, of fighting his nature, of carefully controlled feeding fell away like discarded chains. This was what vampires were truly capable of when driven by purpose greater than mere survival. But even supernatural fury had limits, and there were too many enemies pressing from all sides. A hunter's blade sliced across Caleb's ribs, drawing blood that steamed in the cool air. Another caught him across the shoulder, spinning him around. Maren saw him falter and felt something break inside her chest. Without conscious thought, she did something that would have been unthinkable just hours before she removed her wedding ring, the simple gold band that had marked her devotion to her dead husband, and cast it aside. The gesture was more than symbolic. It was a declaration that her past was truly past, that her future lay with the man fighting for both their lives across this moonlit battlefield. The ring struck the stone floor with a crystalline chime that somehow cut through the clash of weapons and the shouts of dying men. Caleb heard it, understood what it meant, and something fundamental shifted in his bearing. The monster receded, replaced by something far more dangerous, a man who had found love again after centuries of loneliness and would die before letting it be taken from him. He fought with new purpose now, not just the mindless fury of a cornered predator, but the calculated precision of a master warrior protecting his most precious treasure. His blade found gaps in armor, exploited moments of weakness, turned desperate parries into killing strokes. Maren fought beside him, her own sword weaving patterns of defense and attack that her grandmother's stories of warrior queens had never quite prepared. For she was no trained killer, but desperation and love gave her strength beyond her natural limits. When a hunter's blade cut across her forearm, she used her own blood to blind him before Caleb's sword found his heart. The numbers dwindled. 7 became 5, then 3, then 2, as the blessed weapons claimed their toll on both sides. Blood pooled on ancient stones, and the air grew thick with the scent of death. Finally, only Thomas remained, his sword trembling in hands that had once tended gardens with gentle care. The simple groundskeeper was gone, replaced by a man who had sold his soul for silver and found the price too high to bear. "It didn't have to be like this," he said, his voice breaking. "If you had just been what the stories said you were, monsters, predators, things that deserved killing, it would have been clean, simple. But we're not," Maren replied, her sword steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at her limbs. "We're just two people who found each other against impossible odds. And that's what terrifies you, isn't it? That love can exist, even here, even between a monster and a mortal?" Thomas raised his weapon for one final attack, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Caleb's blade took him almost gently, a merciful end to a man who had been destroyed by his own choices long before steel touched flesh. In the sudden silence that followed, Maren and Caleb stood among the fallen, breathing hard and bleeding from a dozen minor wounds. The great hall that had witnessed centuries of history had seen them triumph against impossible odds. "Is it over?" Maren asked, swaying on her feet as adrenaline faded and exhaustion took its place. "It's over," Caleb confirmed, catching her as her legs gave way. "We're alive. We're together. Everything else can be rebuilt." As he held her in the moonlight, filtering through ancient windows, Maren knew that whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced this together, unafraid, and utterly devoted to the love they had found in the darkest of places. Spring came early to Ravencroft that year, as if the castle itself was eager to wash away the memories of blood and betrayal with fresh green growth and gentle rains. Maren stood in the herb garden, her hands deep in rich earth as she planted new seedlings where winter's frost had claimed the old growth. The familiar rhythm of the work soothed her in ways that no amount of rest had managed to achieve. 3 months had passed since the night of the Hunter's siege, and the physical damage to the castle had been repaired with surprising efficiency. Mrs. Blackwood had emerged from the safe room the morning after the battle, taking one look at the carnage in the great hall and immediately setting about organizing the cleanup as if bodies and bloodstains were merely another household inconvenience to be managed. "Sarah, fetch the lye soap," she had said calmly, stepping over Thomas's corpse. "Emma, we'll need fresh rushes for the floors, and someone must see about having new tapestries woven. These will never come clean." The 2 young maids had followed her orders without question, though Maren noticed they gave her and Caleb looks of newfound respect mixed with healthy wariness. They had witnessed their employers fight like demons from legend, had seen the gentle lord of the castle become something far more dangerous when his loved ones were threatened. But they had also seen him tenderly bandage Maren's wounds afterward, his hands gentle as a physician's despite having been weapons just hours before. Mrs. Blackwood, for her part, had simply nodded with satisfaction when Maren quietly moved her belongings from the servants' quarters to the solar she now shared with Caleb. "About time," was all she said, though her smile held enough warmth to light the entire castle. The new brass key in Maren's pocket caught the afternoon sunlight as she worked. Caleb had commissioned it from the village blacksmith as a symbol of their fresh start, not just a key to their shared chambers, but to a future they were building together from the ashes of their separate pasts. "The rosemary is thriving," came his voice from behind her, warm with the affection that had only grown stronger in the months since they had fought for their right to love each other. Maren smiled without turning around, recognizing the soft footstep that announced his approach even in daylight hours. The siege had changed him in subtle ways. He no longer retreated to the deepest parts of the castle during the day, content instead to remain close to her even when the sun made him uncomfortable. "Mrs. Blackwood says rosemary for remembrance," she replied, sitting back on her heels to admire the neat rows of green shoots. "I thought it appropriate. Remembering the dead, remembering the choices that brought us here." She stood and turned to face him, noting how the spring sunshine caught silver threads in his dark hair that she was certain hadn't been there before the siege. Even Thomas, in his way. His betrayal led to our greatest test, and surviving it proved that what we have is strong enough to weather any storm. Caleb moved to her side, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders with the easy intimacy they had developed. "No regrets?" It was a question he asked often, though less frequently now than in the immediate aftermath of the battle. He still struggled to believe that she had chosen him freely, that her love wasn't some temporary madness that would fade with time and reflection. "Only one," she said, reaching up to cover his hands with her earth-stained fingers. His expression tightened with concern. "What regret?" "That it took us so long to stop pretending this was just about cooking and companionship." Her smile was teasing, designed to chase away the shadows that still sometimes haunted his eyes. "We could have been sharing a bed months sooner if we hadn't been so determined to be proper about things." His laugh was rich and genuine, the sound she had come to treasure above all others. "Scandalous woman. What would your grandmother have said about such impropriety?" "She would have said that love is too precious to waste time on foolish conventions." Maren's voice grew more serious. She would have understood that sometimes the heart knows its home long before the mind catches up. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon sunlight paint the castle walls in shades of gold and amber. The building that had once seemed like a prison of shadows and loneliness now felt like exactly what it was, home. "The village miller sent word," Caleb said eventually. "His daughter is to be married next month, and he's requested that we provide bread for the wedding feast. Apparently, your reputation for baking has spread despite our relative seclusion. And you said yes." "I said I would discuss it with my lady, as all such decisions must be made together now." The title sent a warm flutter through her chest, as it always did. Lady Maren of Ravencroft, it had a nice sound to it, though she knew the villagers would whisper about the unconventional courtship that had led to her elevation in status. "Then let's say yes," she decided. It's time this castle opened its doors to celebration instead of hiding from the world. A wedding celebration hosted by a vampire and his mortal bride. The irony is rather delicious. The love is rather genuine, she corrected. And that's all that truly matters. As evening approached, they made their way back to the solar that had become their sanctuary. The room had been refurnished after the siege, but Maren had insisted on keeping Eleanor's fine china and the silver goblet that Caleb still used each evening. The past was part of them both, and honoring it was part of building their future. They dined as they always did, sharing food and conversation and the comfortable intimacy of two people who had chosen each other against all odds. And when the meal was finished and the table cleared, They sat together by the firelight, Merrin's head against Caleb's shoulder, both of them content in the knowledge that they had found something worth fighting for. Outside the windows, night settled gently over the castle and the valley beyond. But inside their sanctuary, warmth and light prevailed, sustained by love that had proven stronger than fear, more enduring than death, and more precious than any treasure that could be counted in coin.